In terms of your career path, so right now, are you primarily doing professorial work, or are you more on the like clinical side of things?
No, no, I have a clinical practice and I also write, and that's where the main focus is now. I really structured my life so that I could take on the book. When I graduated fellowship and was finally done with training, by that point I had bitten off a pretty big chunk of this, and I thought, I really need to protect some time. So it was a matter of I love clinical practice, but getting my clinical practice into a shape where like I could also write. And um, yeah, I also do work with the basically the forensic faculty at Columbia Psychiatry,
Hmm.
which is almost totally unrelated to addiction. I do a lot of work with the immigration law clinic and people seeking asylum evaluations, uh, but also some general teaching about forensics and substance use disorders, which is a really live issue. I had chapters basically of stuff on law and addiction that just was too wonky and too specialized. So that's an
Hmm.
interest. And I'll probably have to, like, at some point, once the book publicity stuff has died down a little bit, I'll sweep up the discarded bits from the floor and see what makes sense and try to make some articles out of it. But the law stuff is the main scholarly focus.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic, and it really came through when I was reading the book as well. I know that I was really blown away by how much detail there was in there about how much digging you've done through history and how much you've put together on these different topics. But I suppose now is probably as good as time as ever to actually actually dive into this show. So thank you, Dr. Fisher, for joining us today on Let's Talk. So for listeners who haven't read the book yet, could you tell us a little bit about what The Urge is about and what your goal was in terms of writing it, what you're hoping to accomplish?
Sure. Yeah. Well, the only real place to start is with the personal motivation, because that's who I wrote it for. I wrote it for myself because it's a book that I myself wanted to read when I was in early recovery from addiction, and it didn't exist. So I went out to write it. The story is that about 10 years ago, I had graduated from med school at Columbia. I was in psychiatry residency training, and I thought I was on top of the world. I was frantically collecting trophies and trying to distinguish myself through external validation. And I was also really struggling with alcohol and stimulant use, stimulants primarily in the form of Adderall. And then that came to a head in my second year of training. I wound up in a manic episode. I was psychiatrically admitted. I eventually had to go to a monitored treatment program for medical professionals. And after a little bit of time, I got out. I was a bit more stable in monitor treatment, was able to return to residency, and I got more interested in addiction naturally. And I got a lot out of psychotherapy training and neuroscience and other forms of scholarly inquiry within medicine. And I also felt like there was more out there. I was thinking to myself, like, really, like I still had this question, like, what had gone wrong with me? And as you know, there's innumerable theories of addiction. And I found so many different ones that were useful, but ultimately, wanted something more synthetic. And I had more of a sense that there was something interesting about history and philosophy and the humanities, especially given that I was coming from bioethics, which has long been interested in philosophical approaches to mental health. And so that's why I set out to explore the history, to start at the beginning
Mhm.
and to see how addiction was understood in different times in different places. So I fold in my personal history throughout, but the book is primarily an intellectual and cultural history, from ancient times to the present, the way different times and different cultures have understood addiction, and more importantly, how individuals have struggled with addiction, how people have attempted to treat addiction, and how people have sought out recovery in various times and places.
And I think that this idea that you're talking about of how can I link my own personal experiences to what others have found, or even how society defines it, is something that is not unique to addiction, and I but is something that confounds a lot of issues around, like, my mind also goes right now to things like eating disorders, where we
Mm.
talk about how often body image and self-judgment, self-value is tied to what society is telling us we should think about it. And the stigma attached to addiction, that just there's, and I should mention for listeners who haven't read The Urge, definitely go buy it, read it. It's a fantastic book. It's so dense in the best possible way. I mean, it was a tremendous learning experience for me. But
Well,
I
thank you
think
for
it
saying that.
really,
It's a real honor. So I appreciate the shout out.
oh yeah, no, of course, of course. But so as you were sifting through all this history and you were seeing, all right, so here's my current historical context, here's what's come before. Did you actually come to the conclusion that there was anything wrong with you in the first place?
Well, I knew that. I mean, by the time I was in a psych ward and mandated treatment, I had to come to terms with the fact that there was something wrong with me for sure. The question was what and how to make sense of it, how to describe it. Uh, but I think the question that comes to mind about that is, to the extent there's something wrong with me, what's wrong with me? What had gone wrong in me? What was it? Because even in rehab, and I don't fault the people there. I think it was a relatively high quality rehab. It's a hell of a lot better than a lot of people get um, in other treatment settings. But even in rehab, it felt oversimplified some of the ways that certain people were presenting the notion of addiction. There was a real essentialist flavor, because we're on a psychology live stream. I can go to more jargon, which is fun for me, so that's nice. But there's more of like an essentialist flavor, in the sense that addiction is a unitary and discrete phenomenon, that all people are alike in the same way, and that once you have it, it's permanent and irreversible. And claims like that are very easily disproven, right? I mean, like,
Mhm.
we've known that since the 1970s, and ever since then, and probably earlier, but since the 1970s, there have been these backlashes, these huge controversies that I describe in the book about how some people from the traditional recovery communities feel these findings are really threatening or dangerous in some way, like they'll somehow corrupt people's ideas of what addiction is. Uh, so, if addiction is not one thing, if it's not a natural kind that exists outside of the historical process and exists unchanged throughout the hundreds and hundreds of years that people have struggled with it, then how do we make sense of it? And that, I mean, that really is the question. There's 100 ways we could go from there. I could stop there, but
Yeah, yeah.
how to make sense of something that's so seemingly amorphous and universal and multi-leveled, and touching upon not just the individual but so many other ways of understanding human suffering. That, I think, is the challenge.
Yeah, and I think, well, one of the themes that I was glad to pick up in your book, because this is something that I know in my work, I have not struggled with, we'll call it classic addiction myself, but have worked with a lot of people who are struggling with it, is that I don't really buy the idea that something is quote unquote wrong with you as a person if you have a
Hmm.
problem with an addiction. You mentioned towards the end of the book, this is not a spoiler, listeners, I promise, but that this is really a human constant. This is something, this idea of, I have suffering, I don't really want to feel this way anymore. And then how do I mitigate this? That's actually something that's very natural for all of us, and it's very easy for, whether or not it's behavioral or chemical, for something to take on a life of its own and go in a negative direction. I think that creating these silos of, oh, like, you now have this label, this defines who you are. Sure, that there might be certain neurological or biological changes or predispositions that happen when you go through that process, but just like any other disease doesn't, which is again an odd word to use, not necessarily the best one, but just like any other, going through a process like that can change you in a way. It doesn't have to define you. It can just be something that's going on, or part of the context, rather than like, I am this is who I am.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. And that's also not a spoiler, because I tease it in the first chapter too. I really firmly believe that addiction exists in all of us, and throughout history, people have tried to divide up people with substance problems or addiction into an us-them binary, and it's caused so much more harm than good. Not only in terms of the immediate concrete harms of weaponizing addiction and using it as a force for racism or oppression or misogyny or what have you, but also causing harm in terms of muddying up our conception of free will and self-control, and how we make sense of human agency. That's why I start off with people like Aristotle and Augustine of Hippo, the theologian, and other early thinkers who, to me, even before there was a word addiction, there was a concept of addiction. But the concept that they were curious about was not, well, how come some people over here are having an extreme problem with gambling? The question was the real mystery that I think is at the heart of addiction. Why do some people do the thing that's harmful, even when they know it's harmful, and even when they have an intention not to do it? And that's at the center of theology. It's the center of a richer conception of sin, not sin as a sort of moral labeling or shaming, as it's sometimes interpreted today, but the real theological puzzle that in many ways is the bedrock for a lot of the science of psychology. Like Bill Miller is a whole book on that, the Judeo-Christian basis of our psychological, cultural, social assumptions about the way humans work. So, if that's really the thing at the heart of addiction, then we all have it. Everybody has the experience that Aristotle called akrasia, the weakness of will, where you make a resolution, but then in the moment, even clear-eyed, seeing that it's not the right thing, you go and you eat the pie you said you didn't eat, or you go check Twitter again, even when you said this is bumming me out and I want to stop it, or you reach for the gaming console, even though you have a test the next day. I mean, everyone has an experience with that. The question, the real differentiator, I think, is more of degree rather than kind.
Sure. And so this idea, though, of doing something that's not good for you, even when you know it's okay, I think part of what I struggle with this whole paradigm as well, though, is the idea that it's all relative. Like my mind goes to the really classic marshmallow experiment about delayed discounting, right? Where you've got a child sitting in front of 2 marshmallows. And if they can wait with those marshmallows for 10 minutes, then they get 10 more, right? But if they eat the 2 marshmallows, then that's all they get. And seeing how much more difficult that is when you have a less developed prefrontal cortex than as you get older, it's one of these executive functioning issues. Or if it even is an issue, because ultimately what's going on in that moment is that the person of any age is thinking, in this moment, I have 0 marshmallows inside of my belly. I could go from 0 to 2. That would be a positive change right now. And I'm in this place of discomfort, versus 12 marshmallows 10 minutes from now means I have to sit with this discomfort of sitting in front of marshmallows for 10 minutes and having none. And so on the one hand, is it better for you in the long run to do that? Probably not. You have 12 marshmallows, but at the end of the day, you're putting a greater value on that immediate shift. You know what I mean?
The Marshmallow Test is interesting because there's been some recent work that calls into question whether it's replicable. So it might be another casualty of the replication crisis. So I am kind of skeptical of the specific example of the Marshmallow Test, which is interesting because ego depletion was also sort of a casualty of the replication crisis. This notion that if people have to exert their will to resist a temptation, this is the Roy Baumeister stuff, then it somehow depletes some finite quantity of willpower, and then you're less able to exert willpower down the line. I have an earlier piece on that where I argue against willpower. I think reducing it to one single dimension is probably simplified. I think, the thing about the marshmallow example that you just described, I think that brings to mind is temporal discounting. And that's an example that everybody has. Everybody has an inborn, or maybe inborn is a loaded word, but everybody has apparently some sort of intrinsic quality of irrationally favoring immediate rewards over delayed rewards. Everybody's on the temporal discounting curve. So I'm not sure that there's a division between the ones who supposedly fail or succeed the marshmallow test. It's just that we all are subject to those behavioral economic principles. And the question is why and how and under what circumstances and what does it matter for your life? We all respond to contingencies. Like some of my own treatment was a response to contingencies. I don't know if I would have entered recovery and been stable if I didn't have negative contingencies. And some of that was purely a function of me being a doctor and having access to certain systems of care. But there's a way, this is where I'm going with this tangent. There's a way that somebody could individualize my story, and maybe on a different day or on a different timeline, I would have individualized my story and say like, hooray for me, I did it all myself. Look at Carl, he recovered. And that's not at all what I take out of my own story. It's in fact the need to get out of the individual framework and go to the social, to the family, to the even the political.
Yeah, and this idea of community being so essential for the recovery process is something that I've seen echoed in a lot of different scholars' work around addiction. That if you try to go at it as an individual, although natural recovery or spontaneous recovery is actually very common, and that's another point that you make in your book. If you are one of the individuals where that's not working out for you, trying to do it on your own does not work out so well. But so getting back at, so I think in this conversation we'll do like your book, and we're going to jump from the airplane view down to the ground level view. So if we jump back up high again for a second, so you've surveyed a tremendous amount of history and looked at how society has viewed addiction over time. When you look at where we are right now with it and trying to learn from the past so as to not repeat it, what do you see as our biggest growth points, the pain points, and then the opportunities to shift?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I promise to answer it, but again, because we're on a live stream and we're on a more specialized podcast, I'll take the privilege of being a little more discursive. I want to say first that I didn't write the book with some sort of prescriptive goal in mind. I didn't have a notion of some sort of policy plank I wanted to argue for, or some sort of favored conclusion. It was really, truly that I wanted to see what the history had to teach. I had the sense that it could help, that the frameworks that I was working with within medicine and neuroscience were useful but incomplete. And I wanted to learn. I literally learn from historians. One of the beautiful things about the book is I got on the phone and I called up historians, and sometimes they're like, "Why are you calling me? You shrink." And sometimes they were extraordinarily generous and really educated me in this beautiful field that has volumes and volumes written on historiography. What do we actually know from history? How can you treat it not just as a sort of like loose humanistic exploration, but how can we be rigorous about the way we think about history? So anyway, I went into the whole investigation thinking, if I went broad and looked at what mattered for myself and for my family and for my patients, then what does the history have to teach? And in that respect, I think, just telling the truth is really useful. That one of my biggest frustrations in writing the book was there's so many oversimplified, pat answers, supposedly miracle cures, or even just like overly narrow, just misleading, narrow definitions. That addiction is this, addiction is that, addiction is best understood in this way, or it's primarily that. And I had a real allergy to it. It really, it was so clearly incomplete in so many cases. It's not to take shots at any individual who tries to put addiction in an explanatory framework, because I think just like psychiatric diagnosis in general, like we have to do the best we can with what we've got and try to theorize so that we can iterate and move forward. But I thought that if there's anything, getting back to your question, Aaron, if there's anything to be gained going forward, it's to pause. It's to pause and use addiction itself and some of these more specific questions about addiction, like disease, like natural recovery, like the role of reductionist biology, whatever, to use them as a cue to pause and to step back and to be more humble about what we know and what we don't know. And at the very least, to recognize addiction as one of our most complex personal, psychological, spiritual, social problems, and to attempt to make sense of it as a multi-level issue, to try to hold multiple perspectives in mind at the same time and treat it with the humility it deserves. And I would hesitate to say that I put much more of a prescriptive goal on it. I mean, there were publishers who turned me down because they said, "What's the takeaway?" I don't know what the takeaway is. This guy over here has a website and a course you can buy where he tells you what the takeaway is. So what's your takeaway? And I said, I don't have a takeaway. I just want to look at the history. But I do think that it does have lessons for connecting across ideological divides and finding points of clarity in communication. And just by getting our arms around certain of the problems, that does naturally sort of light the way forward. I could go off on that, but maybe your next question will relate to that.
Yeah, maybe. Although I wanted to ask a follow-up on this one. I think that this idea of pausing and thinking is something that we as a society right now just don't generally do. And I guess the extra layer is that I think that our society in general also likes, we really like those simple solutions. We like to say, here's the reason why this is going wrong. Here's the fix. Here's the bill that we can pass that's going to solve it. I think that nuance and complexity in today's climate of tweets and everything else, it's very difficult to get across. And I agree with you. These are very multifaceted problems to solve. I know in reading your chapter on epidemics, one of the phrases that you had written there was that there's almost always a quote unquote powerful industry promoting the drug in some way. When you start to see this rise in use and have some sort of major problem there. And I think that ultimately the question, when I think about this in a broader sense, or how addictive substances and the perspectives of them have been weaponized at certain times in the past, I think the question is how can we make it so that changing the perspective on addiction to something that's more complex and nuanced and compassionate is actually in someone's interest high up. Because it seems like the people who make money off of addiction, it sounds like the people who use them as planks in political platforms aren't necessary. I mean, even though quote unquote, solving this issue, although that's probably impossible, but at least mitigating this issue would be financially very advantageous, would be advantageous from a humanitarian point of view. There's a lot of benefits. It always seems like the lowest common denominator around societal changes in addiction is money or power.
Yeah. I think that is a good segue. And I agree with you. It's one of the biggest challenges, that money, power, systems of control, capitalism, as long as profit is the organizing principle when it comes to selling these commodities and when it comes to providing healthcare, I think in a sense we're doomed. That's not to be fatalistic or overly pessimistic, because I do think that there are other ways we could think about these not ordinary commodities, and there are other ways that we could think about health and healthcare. One of the reasons I'm in Portugal right now is because I wanted to step outside of my own limited experience as a Northeasterner, ivory tower Ivy Leaguer, to get a sense of just what are the deeper societal perspective. Like how is it that the United States does not see healthcare as a human right, when basically any other developed or close to developed country in the world, acknowledging the problems with that term, they do see it as a human right. Which is not to say that I set out to that I'm setting out now, or that when I was writing The Urge that I set out to make some sort of polemical argument. When it comes to addiction supply industries like you were just describing, I could have set out to write something that was very deliberately against the alcohol industry, and sort of raising the alarm and calling for much more explicit restrictions, and talking about how exactly we should be reformulating our policy. And people have done that. Like Thomas Barber comes to mind. It's a great book, academic book, No Ordinary Commodity. And then other scholars like Robin Room and so many others who are affiliated with the WHO. Like the WHO keeps on raising the alarm about how far we are behind in our alcohol policies and how much unnecessary suffering that causes. But but that doesn't really, I mean, it works and it doesn't, right? Like it's a piece of the puzzle. I think we need the policy approaches and the wonkish approaches. And I think that people respond to story, and that people need consciousness raising, for lack of a better term. And so if I can tell the story of, say, how the early pioneers of Alcoholics Anonymous unwittingly found themselves in a sort of tacit alliance with the alcohol industry, and how some of their messaging might have been harmfully appropriated by the alcohol industry to over individualize the problem of alcoholism, then that, that's gripping for a different sort of audience. So I don't know that there's like an answer for how to solve it necessarily, other than we need multiple perspectives. We need the story, we need the narrative, and we also need the policy work, and we need the research. We need to fund that research in the first place. Like, how much work is the NIAAA doing on research that is critical of the alcohol industry? Not much. There are reasons for that. So I don't know. I think like the looking deeply doesn't lead itself to a specific prescriptive policy answer, but it can be an antidote to some of the polarized binaries that people get stuck into sometimes.
Yeah. Well, and I think the idea of something prescriptive is illusory in this, right? In this context entirely. So the opioid epidemic you cover in the book as well. And I think that this is one of those areas where we're seeing these principles play out in real time, where we've had, as overdose deaths have continued to increase year over year. And then this huge spike, of course, in 2020 over the course of the pandemic, we've seen the character of it change as things have moved more from prescription pills to heroin to fentanyl. And the reasons why people are still dying right now also changes. I remember the AMA, American Medical Association, put out a paper as they're working with the CDC to revise opioid prescribing guidelines, basically saying, look, we've actually curtailed a lot of this prescribing, but people are still dying at a really heavy clip. And so maybe it's not about prescribing anymore. And, prescribing has a role to play for sure, but it's true. People have been started down a pipeline from that, and now there's different interventions necessary. And there's also a whole group of people who may one day find themselves overdosing on fentanyl or heroin, who were never prescribed opioids legally in the first place. Right. And so the people working on this have spanned from medicine to policymakers to police officers and drug courts to, just all over the place, trying to figure out how do we wrap our arms around this. And unfortunately, to this date, we haven't. We're still seeing, month over month, as the CDC releases provisional data, the overdose rate continues to increase. So we haven't cracked the nut. And I think it's because it's exactly like you're saying, there's no one right answer here. We have to create the right mix of solutions that actually starts to have this go down, and we just haven't gotten there yet.
Right. And in fact, the search for an end is often doing more harm than good. So the notion that we could end addiction, or the notion that we could end an epidemic, I think is probably misguided. Throughout history, usually when one of the biggest surprises of the book was finding how far back in history we've been having drug epidemics. And usually it's not that someone comes up with some sort of technocratic change or a policy tweak or a new technology to somehow stop it. Usually an epidemic burns itself out because of social changes or demographics or a change in technology, or simply because society develops a new set of social mores and social knowledge about how to use a substance, whether it's a new substance or a new formulation of an older substance. So, it's a great example is what you were just talking about, that people seized on the notion of prescription opioids as the single most important cause. And by clamping down on it, did more harm than good, almost certainly. So the harm to pain patients who are unnecessarily deprived of adequate pain relief, and harm in the sense of pushing people toward unregulated markets where they're subject to really chancy encounters with fentanyl and even stronger compounds. I think that addiction is not something we end. And as long as we operate within that framework, it's very dangerous. It's just like at the individual level, trying to manipulate or escape or somehow change our suffering is often doing more harm than good. I think at the social
Hmm.
level, trying to control or stop or cure goes to a very dangerous place.
Hmm.
Excuse me.
Oh, no
Maybe I'm
problem.
getting my son's cold now. Uh-oh.
No worries, no worries. Well, so transitioning for a second here. So one of the topics that I speak on the most are these addiction supply industries, as you write about in your book, and about how they do drive a lot of purchasing trends. It was really heartening to see you also identify them being oftentimes at the core of a lot of these surges in certain types of drug use. I know that for parents as well, the ones that I speak to, this is of particular concern to them because they feel like in many ways young people are in the crosshairs, and it's been this way, as you mentioned as well, throughout history, in terms of alcohol, in terms of nicotine. Right now vaping is a huge one as well. From your perspective, and from the historical perspective that you've gathered and coalesced in this book, what is the appropriate response to something like this, where you actually have people who are profiting off of creating more dependency, creating that addictive cycle?
Yeah, I don't know that there's an easy answer, other than saying that outright prohibition generally doesn't work, uh, and total unfettered free market capitalism, free for all, unregulated capitalism doesn't work either. Um, I really like the phrase that Mark Kleeman used, the now past public policy scholar at NYU. He called it grudging toleration, which I think is a nice rubric, but it's not very specific. It's that it's grudging because these are products that have a natural hold on human desire, and that nicotine is stronger than broccoli and heroin is stronger than broccoli. But the toleration comes in the fact that every human society on the face of the planet has found a way to alter their consciousness, almost always through drugs. And when in the very, very, very few examples where it hasn't been drugs, people engage in shamanic breathing or spinning around in a circle until they change their consciousness. There's always been a search for intoxication. So then what do we do with that? Uh, and because of the market forces we've been discussing, there's been a pendular motion from outright prohibition to totally and once prohibition fails, totally unfettered, laissez-faire, free market capitalism. And you don't have to be anti-capitalist to say that free for all, unregulated capitalism of potentially harmful goods can be really harmful. But especially because the backdrop of our social and political discourse is so polarized and so ideologically driven, I think it's really hard to find that thoughtful middle ground.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think that thoughtful middle ground, again, there's that idea of pausing for a second and thinking, is so critical in this regard, because it's true. I don't think that anyone, if you actually stopped and thought about it, who was saying, you know what, I think we need an extreme hardline policy because that's gone so well in like any arena throughout history, they probably wouldn't say that. But I think that when you're inside of it, or particularly when you attach fear to it, or those really alarmist stories, like for example, people, you see all these stories about people dying from opioids right now. It's very easy then to hear that and be like, we need to take extremely harsh action right now in order to do something about it, when in actuality what's really required is thought and some action, but finding that midpoint.
Yeah, I don't think I agree with you. I don't think that anybody who actually cares about drugs and drug use has ever said, "Oh, complete and total crackdown prohibition is the way to solve this problem." Um, there are people who very intentionally enacted those regimes, such as Hamilton Wright, Harry Anslinger, the later Richard Nixon, as opposed to the earlier Richard Nixon, who are almost like two different people, and the Reagan administration. Many of the forces that aligned to push a hardline prohibitionist agenda were doing so for explicitly racist motivations that the vilification of drug use was an end. They didn't, looking at the historical record, it's hard to come to the conclusion that they actually cared about drugs or drug use. But it was the notion that addiction itself was being used as a weapon. The idea of addiction was being employed in a bigger picture. And that's another reason why I think it's really important to watch out for the simple causes and the simple explanations that we attach to drug use and to addiction, because whenever we wander into that territory, there's such over and over again through hundreds of years, people have divided up users into good users and bad users, and it always redounds to hurt everybody. It's never just that the harm is restricted to the people against whom the addiction is being weaponized and used. When racist policies led to harsh crackdowns in the 1920s, for example, that undermined the whole situation and led to American medicine largely abandoning the care for addiction. And then that's part of the arc of the book and my own experience and training and my own work in the criminal justice system, as well as my own experience in the treatment system, was seeing how that legacy is still there with us. So it's not just like virtue signaling or posturing, that like I saw myself, like how that racist abandonment came back to hurt me and hurt my family, even though I was a super privileged upper middle class white kid from New Jersey. And I don't think anybody anticipated that when say, for example, Hamilton Wright and Harry Anslinger in the early part of the century found that it was just convenient for their political careers and fit with their established prejudices. So I just think we have to be very, very careful about what we call a good drug and a bad drug in the end. It doesn't mean that there's not a space for careful regulation, just that to paint with such a broad brush as to say this is a bad drug and it needs to be squashed out has almost always redounded to cause more harm than good.
Yeah, and I think that this, hindsight being 2020, or at least more accurate than when you're inside a moment and trying to judge it, I think that we've seen that there are certain policies that end up coming back and hitting us in the face, and others that seem like they're actually positive and progressive and helpful. And making sure that right now we're on that right track is so important. I'm thinking, it was coming to mind right now, just in terms of how these ideas all get intermixed. So here in Illinois, we created a recreational cannabis market about 2 years ago, I think, 3 years ago, actually, I think now. And one of the primary drivers for that was this idea of restorative justice or social justice of some sort. And what was so interesting about it at the time was that actually the Illinois NAACP was against commercialized marijuana or cannabis products. They were against that policy. They felt like, of course, decriminalization, legalized possession, there's some issues with policing, but they were of the opinion that having more access points and pumping this into communities would actually just further inequities and further gaps. And actually what's borne out here over the last 3 years, quite literally, this was written about in the Chicago Sun-Times, I think a couple months back, we have zero dispensary owners of color in the state, not a single one. It is all white people selling these drugs to other white people, but then also people of color. And just continuing this, even when at the outset it was explicitly stated that it was going to be different. And it's just one of those moments where it's like, can we learn something? Like how do we not just repeat this over and over and over again?
Yeah. I don't think that there's any little policy fix that will successfully resist the broader currents that we're swimming in. That ultimately it will fit itself, whatever policy intervention we do will fit itself to the prevailing values and beliefs and commitments of the culture as a whole. And we have a very dysfunctional relationship with substances, all told. We have a lot of really misguided ideas about what drugs do and who should be using drugs and who shouldn't be using drugs, and what constitutes a white market versus a gray market versus a black market. Those are very instructive terms. And again, it's very strongly instituted in that 1920 period that I discussed when we had the Harrison Act. And there's a sort of like backdoor effort by the Treasury Department to try to criminalize opioids and cocaine initially. It wasn't even clear that the federal government had the power to do that in the 1920s. That's why they had to do it through a tax bill. This weird, like, it's incredible that it survived this long, and that it's inconceivable that we would dismantle it somehow. Although there may be more beneficial ways of modifying it, but the drive to sort of classify good use, bad use, and to try to structure the economies of drug use, I don't know, will ultimately pervade all things like that. Psychedelics also, you were talking about vaping, even ketamine treatment. I think some of these things are really wonderful. I've seen tremendous improvements in patients who have gotten ketamine that's been administered in a useful and helpful way. And also, like, what happens when ketamine and other psychedelics are employed in a relentlessly profiteering and reductionist way that is stripped away from any sort of connection to the actual human experience of taking a psychedelic. I really worry about that. Not so much for like today, because it's still relatively circumscribed, but if we treat it as if it's just a brain hack, or as if it's just acting on a brain and we're dumb meat machines, that opens the door to a lot of these sorts of economic and social problems that we've been talking about.
Absolutely. Or even the jump that I think is very clear to folks like us, but if you're not as inside this world, you might not be, of between, like, we're getting all these really promising studies in psychedelic science out of like Johns Hopkins and really centers of excellence. That's not the same as just using it yourself outside of the therapeutic context. Like, those are very different paradigms, but we're hearing that research being used as look at the possible medicinal benefit from this, the therapeutic benefit. Ergo, anyone should be able to just buy it, use it, self-medicate, that sort of thing. That's a jump. But that's unfortunately where we're at right now. And I think that, just looking at where investments are going, there's a lot of financial interest again behind moving that process forward.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I mean, that the psychedelics obviously has relevance to many forms of suffering. But I think addiction is a nice model, and a theme that I kept on returning to was the fact that medicine alone is not enough. That throughout history, people have needed medicine to save lives from addiction problems, and also there has been non-medical mechanisms and practices and fellowships, predating AA in some cases by hundreds of years, where people sought something like recovery completely outside of a medical context. So I think it's really important, because I don't think the answer for psychedelics is just to medicalize it either. The psychedelics come from a sacramental and religious basis. Clearly there's something worrying about somebody who says, oh, Johns Hopkins published a study, so I'll trip acid this weekend and maybe that'll help me with my serious problem. But I'm not sure that the physicians need to be the gatekeepers for psychedelics either. But how do we construct a new morality? How do we construct a new sacrament? How do we construct a new framework for healing that is not necessarily medical, while we're still burdened by these drug laws? I don't know what the answer is. All I do know is that, like, just like in my own life, I've always needed, I'm in therapy still today. I love psychotherapy. I needed structured addiction treatment early in my own recovery. And I also really need mutual help. And I also really need spiritual practice. And like, do I need them so that I don't relapse tomorrow? I don't think so. I mean, I probably wouldn't. I'm not going to take that chance. But what I need it for is flourishing, and the need for human flourishing is directly contiguous with recovery. Because I wouldn't relapse tomorrow, but like, would I relapse 5 years if I didn't work on being with and working with my own suffering? I don't know. So we're getting a little far afield from
it actually makes. It makes a great segue. We've gone down the funnel back down to the individual, which is fantastic, because I wanted to make sure that we talked a little bit about that too. So you have all this fantastic perspective, both in terms of lived experience, historical context. How do you, when you actually are working with patients in your practice, how do you translate that? Is it something that comes up very much? Is this something where, what's your process like, given everything that you've gathered over the years around this?
It comes up more now that I have a book out, so that's that's a simple answer. But I think it's really important to be very careful about drawing on lived experience in psychotherapy. I think it's really important to be thoughtful about self-disclosure. And I think that the tradition I was trained in, especially at Columbia University, tends to be pretty old school, ego psychological, psychoanalytic, and in some cases almost tending toward like blank screen therapists should disclose nothing. And I don't think that's a way for me either. I think it's very few people I think that would actually ascribe to that view. But it was reassuring to me to see historical examples of people in therapeutic roles practicing self-disclosure about their own struggles going back hundreds of years, even predating Freud and some of the early examples of psychotherapy. We had versions of psychotherapy before before Freudian psychiatry made its way to the United States. There's William James, and then there's a somewhat affiliated clinic called the Emmanuel Clinic that was in Boston, and many other sort of offshoots and related experiments with psychotherapies, some of which really seem to help a lot of people. So I mean, in answer to your specific question, what do I actually do with patients? I do normal psychotherapy where they come in and we set goals, and maybe it's more long-term psychodynamic, or maybe it's more sort of like third wave behavioral. I really like ACT. So working very explicitly and even giving homework and plans, especially around mindfulness, which is a major interest and specialty of mine. And then when the self-disclosure comes up, I'm only just now starting to work with, because I didn't really bring it in of my own accord. I just thought I had this separate thing going. I was writing a book. I cared deeply about the book. And I thought to myself, one day the book's going to come out and I'll have to talk about this shit. So I will. and then when the book was far enough along, I had to tell my patients, like, hey, listen, I'm thinking about writing about our work together, and I want to make sure that you understand that I would disguise you, and and like, how do you feel about that? And would you feel comfortable with this thing or that thing? And so that engendered some conversations. What I can say is that it was really encouraging to me that a lot of patients found it really motivating to hear that I was in recovery, because I think it's inescapable that someone goes into psychotherapy and has the notion like, oh, this is some sort of shaman with expert wisdom who is farther along on the path than I am, or maybe they're of a different kind than I am. This gets back to the whole us-them notion of addiction, and addiction existing in all of us. And for them, multiple patients independently describing to me, like, it was really good to hear that you struggle with something similar to what I had struggled with. And I can't put my finger on why, but it gave me a sense of hope that people can change and that I could be different. And so, and then immediately take like really powerful values committed action and seeing nice changes in their lives. So, it's not really my practice to bring it up a lot of my own accord. And I tend to be very, very, very careful with that. I just read, here's another plug. I just read Mark Epstein's Zen of Psychotherapy, which is a new book by the Buddhist psychiatrist Mark Epstein, fantastic writer and speaker. He's been doing this stuff. He's been writing on Buddhism and psychiatry for, I guess, 25 years. His first book was mid-90s. And it's only in this most recent book that he's talking about how he's explicitly bringing Buddhism into his psychotherapy practice. So I think there's good cause for caution, like making sure that it's being done with total respect for the patient, and like pretty solid understanding that this is not just like, I don't know, self-indulgence, or because it can be lonely to spend a whole day doing private practice psychotherapy, that it really is for the benefit of the patient. You have like reasonable confidence that it's going to be helpful to the patient.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that when I think about some of the biggest differences, and there are many, between psychotherapy and just, like, say, quote unquote, talking it out with a friend, is that the therapist on the other
Chat,
side is
right?
constant. Yeah, yeah, like a chat is like we're constantly thinking, like, how will my verbal, how will this assist the person on the other side of the interaction? What do I? It's a completely actually unidimensional way of thinking, and so self disclosure is. Yeah, I mean, it's got to be for the benefit of the person who's there trying to get help from you, not for your own. But I do think that there's a lot of room for bringing. I think that the connection element of therapy can't be understated, or underscored enough. It has to be there. And what I've found is that over time, the more human I am, the less distance I create. Certainly, it has to be therapeutic. We have different roles in the room, but at the same time, if you are real and actually partner with someone to get them somewhere else, I just find it allows for someone to feel more emotionally safe, open up a bit more, connect, and that link then engenders more action outside of therapy, more work, and more success.
Right. Yeah. And that's the only thing that we know actually works in therapy. Like, I really believe in thinking rigorously about psychotherapy. And if we're going to be epistemological about it, like, it's alliance. That's where the money is. So,
Mhm.
creating that human connection is probably the most important thing that we do.
100%. Well, hey, so before we finish up, I had one more question that for me is a little bit self-indulgent myself, but I myself have been meditating for about 5 or 6 years now. I have a mindfulness practice, and so when I saw that this is something that's close to your heart as well, I would definitely want to ask about it. How do you feel that the mindfulness component, that the Zen component, makes its way into what you do professionally? And are there certain elements that you feel are more helpful than others, particularly if someone is struggling with an addiction?
Yeah. It's such a big topic. It's such a live topic too, because mindfulness is such a buzzword, and it's so easy just for people to put mindfulness up on their Psychology Today profile and say, like, I went on a meditation retreat and therefore I practice mindfulness based therapy. And it would be easy for me to do that too. I'm not putting
Oh
myself up on a
no.
pedestal to say that I'm better. Um, I just think that there are many ways. Ronald Purser wrote this good book called Mindfulness. There are many ways that mindfulness has been sold
Yeah.
as a panacea, and there are real dangers, I think, of stripping the notion of mindfulness away from the culture and the broader set of wisdom traditions in which it was situated. Mindfulness was not like a hack that ancient societies, from the Buddha to the Hindu practices to the Christian desert fathers, like they didn't do it because they wanted to sleep better. And at the same time, there are studies on things like mindfulness based stress reduction that say just doing mindfulness on its own can be really helpful. So I think we have to hold that paradox together.
Hmm.
So taking ACT as an example, I think most of the A of ACT, most of the acceptance stuff is basically mindfulness. It's basically getting off automatic pilot and paying attention. If we're talking about defusion and looking closely at the self and
It's
all
like at
that stuff,
least 2 out of the 6 parts of the hexaflex, if I recall, right? Something
totally,
like that.
100%, yeah. And in a way, I mean, you could apply it to all of them, but definitely definitely those two, like the self and the defusion points. Um, so I think that I do introduce mindfulness as an intervention. I teach people in mindfulness along those sort of evidence supported, more like manualized guides like that, including mindfulness based relapse prevention, which really is a group uh, intervention, but I adapt it to individuals, as many people do. Uh, and also, I have been on a trajectory, I think, in my own clinical practice of being just following the patient more and being less of a booster about mindfulness. I believe in it very deeply. It's been absolutely transformational in my own life. I don't know if I would have been able to um, enter recovery from addiction without um, contemplative practice as a whole. But I also think that there's something in the broader wisdom traditions about what you could call virtue ethics, about morality and about practice with precepts and paying attention to the cause and effect of our actions in the world. And that, I mean, that gets at the back end of acting. You can talk about values, and it's not your job to like put your values on someone, but I think it's very useful to clarify values and do work around values, following the patient's lead. And that's the part of contemplative practice that I think is not, it's not quite made itself way into mindfulness as it's commonly understood, and that I think is really interesting. And if you talk to people like Eric Garland or Katie Witkowitz or others who are doing research on mindfulness interventions, they know this, and I think they're interested in it, and they're developing ways of exploring these types of tensions. So I think it's really exciting. Actually, it's an opportunity for that particular branch of our field. But for today, I introduce it, but lightly, and I don't think it's the whole story.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a good way for us to stick the landing today, is to say that probably nothing is the whole story. And that is part of why you have to write a book about it, because there's a lot to say. There's a lot that's happened, and we will see how this all pans out. So thank you so much, Dr. Fisher, for coming on the show today. Do you have anything that you'd like to leave listeners with as we finish up?
No, not really. I don't have like a call to the audience or any sort of like final words of wisdom. It's like you said, it took a book. If anything, one of my favorite Zen sayings is "open mouth already a mistake." These are very complicated topics to talk about, and in a way to come down on one side or the other, I think is already misleading. So if you're interested in this stuff, check out my book. It's on my website. I've got a podcast myself there, and I'd love to be in connection with people. So thank you for having me on.
My pleasure. And thanks everybody for listening in. We will catch up with you again soon.